Welcome back to our monthly series with Greg McGeorge from JMI Wealth. Greg has over 35 years of experience in financial markets, both here and in London, and JMI Wealth manage over $6 billion in investments. This month, Greg is going to be talking about the re-emergence of distressed debt funds, or what sometimes is called Vulture funds, and how they work. So if you want to chat more with Greg about your investments or the market in general, then you can find him at jmiwealth.co.nz. Vulture funds, that sounds something that's a bit ominous.
It's a great name, isn't it? And not surprising, Vulture funds prefer to be known as distressed debt funds. And it's probably a bit unfair to lump all distressed debt funds into the Vulture fund camp. But either way, I'm going to use the names interchangeably. At the end of the day, though, these funds are involved in buying debt at very, very cheap rates. Distressed debt at cents on the dollar, and their ultimate goal is to make a return for their investors, and they do this by going in distressed companies or even sovereign states who are financially struggling, buying up their debt for cents on the dollars, renegotiating better terms so that they can get a better outcome for their investment. And the reason I've picked this is I've just started to see more and more mentions about distressed debt funds in the media over the last few months. So I thought it would be a really good topic to cover.
Yeah, cool. So when did this first come about?
1980s is cited as being the birth of the Vulture Fund. And in the 1980s, we had a debt crisis in Latin America. And the crisis came about through excessive amounts of debt, coupled with, at the time, a spike in interest rates. Sounds sort of familiar. So Latin American countries at the time really struggled to pay back the loans from the syndicated international banks that they had borrowed from. So back then, the way governments funded themselves is they would go to syndicates of international banks and borrow money, as opposed to now, when you look at government funding, the way most countries do that now is they issue bonds into the market. So during the crisis, the international banks who had lent them the money decided, okay, well, they're financially troubled, we'll work with them to renegotiate and restructure the debt levels. And they did this in various ways, like extending terms, etc. But come the late 80s, it was still very obvious that these Latin American countries were still struggling financially. So this is when it was early 1989 when the US Treasury Secretary Nicholas Brady came up with the Brady Plan. And it was pretty simple. The goal was to take these loans off the balance sheets of these banks. The banks had to take a haircut or reduce the amount that they were owed, but they would repackage these bank loans into government bonds that could be then traded in the open market. So the banks got rid of these underperforming loans, albeit they took a haircut, and now they were able to trade in the open market. And this worked well. The banks got rid of the debt off their balance sheet, and also these Latin American countries had less debt owing.
So did this Brady Plan work?
It did. It was generally viewed as a success. So the restructure created what became known as Brady bonds, and yes, they were viewed as being a success for the reason just discussed. They took the debt off these international banks' balance sheets. They reduced the amount that these Latin American countries owed, so that was viewed as a win-win. However, like most things, you have unintended consequences. So yes, it worked, it viewed as a success, but now you suddenly had this secondary market where investors could buy and sell Latin American debt. And it was that key change that brought around about how restructures of government debt would happen in the future. So up until then, the lenders were international banks. They were happy to negotiate with the Latin American countries to restructure. So they had a lot of reputational risk. The last thing these banks wanted was to wake up one morning and see the front page of the Wall Street Journal or the Financial Times talking about how they'd bankrupt some impoverished Latin American country. So they were always happy to negotiate. But now you had this secondary bond market. So not only did you have international banks buying debt, but potentially you had all these other investors like hedge funds that could come into the market and buy their bonds, and their interests were not always aligned. So these hedge funds were more interested in getting a substantial return on their investors' funds, whereas perhaps those international banks were more inclined to negotiate with these Latin American banks. And a good example was in 1996, which is probably the very first Vulture fund. A hedge fund called Elliott and Associates spent about $12 million on buying Peruvian government bonds. So Peru was financially troubled. Their government bonds were trading for cents on the dollar. So for their $12 million investment, they were able to get a face value of $55 million. So think about it. For every dollar of debt, they only had to pay 22 cents to buy it. Now, the other lenders were the international banks, who were more than happy to negotiate a deal with the Peruvian government. But Elliott Associates said absolutely not. And they sued the Peruvian government for the full $55 million. So the Peruvian government had no option. They had to pay Elliott Associates the full $55 million just to get them out of the way so they could continue negotiating with the international banks. And it was this one trade that was, I guess, the proof of concept that showed all other hedge funds that actually vulture funds can be highly profitable, and this one trade paved the way for future vulture funds.
Wow. Are there any instances where vulture funds can benefit the borrower?
Absolutely, and this is what I mentioned earlier. It's unfair to lump all distressed debt funds in the vulture fund camp. Yes, there are distressed debt funds out there that can add value to a distressed business. By purchasing distressed debt so cheaply, for literally cents on the dollar, the fund can negotiate better terms for the borrower. They might want to reduce interest rates or even write off some of that loan, extend maturities. They can do all of this and still make money because they've bought it so lowly. And some distressed funds will actively engage with the management of the company. You'll find there will be highly experienced professionals involved with these distressed debt funds. So some of them can be more than happy to work with the management, talk about business strategies, talk about turnaround strategies, how to improve cash flow, how to get access to new markets, how to basically turn around the company and start making money. So yes, distressed debt funds can be good for some businesses if they actively engage with management on turnaround policies and use their own expertise to do that. And obviously the hope is that the value of the company goes up, and with it the value of those bonds that they originally bought very, very cheaply will also go up. And that is definitely an exit strategy that some of those funds employ.
So you're saying there are good funds and there are bad vulture funds?
Exactly. Vulture funds at the end of the day, or distressed debt funds at the end of the day, are out to make money for their investors, give them a return on their investment. They don't care if it's the borrower that pays them or if it's other lenders that end up paying them, as long as they get a return for their investment. And there's quite a funny story, a case not long ago where a distressed debt fund or a vulture fund came in and actually proactively worked for a better outcome for the borrower at the expense of the lenders. So it was about 2016, Revlon Revlon International borrowed about 1.8 billion US from a syndicate of banks. And that loan was secured by their Revlon's assets, which were primarily their brand names, Elizabeth Arden, for instance, being one of the key ones. Revlon, not long after that, ran into some serious financial difficulty, and their debt started trading at cents on the dollar. This distressed debt fund came in and started buying up this debt from the original banks. And then in about 2020, at the request of the distressed debt fund, Revlon went and negotiated a restructure of their 2016 loan. So what they did is they took the assets that were securing that original loan and transferred them into a new company. And the way they did that is the distressed debt fund that was involved went around negotiating with the other lenders to execute the restructure. Now the thing is, under the docs, you don't need 100% of the lenders to agree to the restructure. You only need 51%. So the hedge fund goes and gets 51%, it gets the majority to agree to the restructure, and it takes those lenders and the asset into the new company. At that point, Revlon then borrows more money from the new company, uses that money to repay the 51% that agreed, and rolls them into the new fund. So the 49% are left with still a loan, but now they've got no security, and chances of getting much money back suddenly highly unlikely. So what then happened is, not long after that, Citibank, who were Revlon's bankers, were instructed by Revlon to pay the usual 6-monthly interest payment to the borrowers, and this included the other 49% who hadn't been rolled over on far more attractive terms. But Citibank, instead of paying out a couple of $1 million in interest, accidentally repaid the whole loan, which at that time was nearly $1 billion US. So if you're the 49% who are basically feeling like you've been cheated, you're going, great days, happy days, I've just got all my money back, and walk away. So it turned out Revlon didn't have $1 billion US. So it was Citibank's own money that they had accidentally used to repay the lenders. Now naturally, Citibank went and said, okay, look, sorry, we made a payment mistake, give us the money back. Obviously the 51% who had been rolled over into the new ones, yeah, fine, here it is. But that still left about $500 million US to the other 49%, and they refused to pay it back. It was just hilarious. So Citibank, well, okay, this is we'll just take you to court. It's obvious we paid it in error, so you'll have to repay it. The court found in favour of the lenders and said, no, you can keep the money. So I was like, oh, okay. So now Citibank are in the hole for $500 million US. Anyway, Citibank took it another step higher, and I don't know. Sort of unfortunately, you feel like Citibank ended up winning, and they did get their money back eventually.
Yeah.
But yeah, an interesting example of where a distressed debt fund comes in, and yes, you think it's all about trying to extract value from the company. Well, actually, they were cheating, you could say, although legally, some of the other lenders.
Yeah,
wow. It was interesting.
Fascinating, yeah. So what's the process a venture capital fund goes through when buying this kind of distressed debt?
Yeah, there's several things they typically want to understand and review. Obviously, price is extremely important. The cheaper they can buy the debt, the better recovery or return of their money and return for their investors. At the end of the day, these guys are looking to buy when everyone is selling. So in some instances, they can pretty much name their price. So that is important. But another important factor in any bond is the recovery potential. So typically bonds will sit higher up in the capital structure of a company, whereas shareholders are at the bottom and typically get wiped out if a company goes into liquidation. But bondholders sit higher in the capital structure and are more likely to be repaid if a company does go into liquidation. So they will want to understand what sort of rates of recovery are there being. So if they buy 20 cents on the dollar, well, if they get 40 cents back on the dollar, they've doubled their money. So that recovery rate is really, really important. And a real biggie is the legal jurisdiction and the regulatory framework they work under, or that debtor works under. So this is a really important one. So is that company operating in a jurisdiction that has historically honoured legal commitments like loan agreements? So if they're operating in a jurisdiction which the laws say, yes, you are absolutely owed this money, then that's obviously a big tick for them. They know if they have to go to the courts, they're going to get a good outcome. And obviously they'll also look at that collateral, the security behind it. If in a fire sale, what do they think they can get for that, and how will that repay their debt? And another important thing they will look at, so it's not always just buying and trying to get a quick return on their money. It might actually be a longer term investment. So if you're buying a dollar's debt for 20 cents and that dollar is paying 3, 4, 5% interest rate, well, you've only had to pay 20 cents for it. If the company can still generate cash flow, it can still continue to pay you the interest on that bond. Now, it's such a huge discount. That's a massive yield, and so even though they're not getting repaid in full, they're still getting on the way through this massive yield. So if the company can still generate cash flow as well, they'll happily sit in there and take that yield.
So they may even get the 25% return year on year, and one day get 500%
and get the capital back
on. Yeah,
that's exactly right.
Yeah, fantastic. Is there any way you can prevent a Vulture fund buying your debt?
Well, the problem is because debt can be bought and sold on the open market as what's called referred to as a property right. Actually, for instance, did you know if you look at your mortgage loan docs, there will be wording in there that allows the bank to sell your debt to a third party if it wants.
Right.
Yes, and no, you're not going to get the bank to change the wording on that as well.
Greg used to be my banker. You never said that to me when I was doing mortgages with you.
You need to talk to your lawyer. They should have disclosed everything. and it's because of this key clause that vulture funds and even debt collectors have a lawful right to full repayment of that loan, even though they weren't the original lender. However, so yeah, it's interesting you bring that up, because in some markets there are actually restrictions on who can lend to or even buy the company of a debt. And these restrictions happen in the private equity market. So it's something called a white list, or an approved list of lenders and buyers. And the reason private equity firms do it is typically when they purchase a company, they borrow a lot of money to buy the company, and they laden that company, newly purchased company, with the debt. So if that company doesn't perform, or there's a market downturn in the future, that company may struggle to fund its loan, its sudden burden of debt that it's had to inherit from the private equity firm. So the last thing a private equity firm wants, if one of their companies, stable companies, does get into trouble, is some distressed debt fund coming in, buying the debt very, very cheaply, and bossing and making demands to the management around what they need to do. So the private equity firms created a white list. They say, okay, you're a friendly bank, you can lend to our companies, and you can buy their debt. Although saying that, white lists are actually being challenged in the courts as being unfair practices by distressed debt funds.
Yeah. So will that mean then that there could be a global ban on these vulture funds?
Well, they're talking about banning them buying sovereign debt from impoverished countries. So while vulture funds are often associated with aggressive debt collection type strategies, it's not always the case that these funds are solely focused on extracting maximum value without considering the debtor's situation. In some instances, as we mentioned, these funds can actually add value to a company because of its expertise that it has in turning around companies. So there's definitely a place for distressed funds. However, the primary goal generally of a vulture fund is to get in, see an opportunity, and get money out and return it to its investors. That is the primary goal, and which you could argue that's the primary goal of most funds, is to make a healthy return for its investors. And these tactics can sometimes lead to contentious negotiations or aggressive tactics, as we just talked about with the Peruvian government debt negotiation. Especially, it can become quite aggressive if the fund believes there's a real opportunity to maximize return for its investors. So it may well go in very, very hard. I mean, at the end of the day, though, the moral of the story is just be careful who owns your debt.
Yeah. Well, it makes me think as well, though, like, if your debt's up for sale, right? Maybe not if you're a sovereign nation with this debt, but if you're a big corporate and your debt's for sale, can you just go and buy your own debt for cents in the dollar?
Absolutely. If it's trading in the open market, and this is exactly what happened during the GFC. So there was such fear in the market that even well-capitalized, massive multinational corporates who still had incredibly good balance sheets, their debt was knocked down. I mean, it wasn't trading for cents on the dollars, but it might be trading for 85 or 90 cents on the dollars. So it's still a significant discount. And that's actually what happened. Some of these large corporates had cash on their balance sheet and they're going, well, how should we use this? Let's buy our debt back. This is absolutely brilliant. Not all investors were thrilled that they went and did this, but for a shareholder, you're issuing debt at 100 cents and you're buying it back at 90 cents. That was a great deal for the company.
But Greg, we do know that this week there's really only one story that we do want to talk about.
Yes, all right then. As you brought it up, Rick. Yes, it's over. The 2 million metre challenge is finally over. And it was a bit odd. I did it on Monday, so I had a day to spare, and I was quite excited. I finished it, and then I felt a bit hollow. I thought, what am I going to do now? So
you did your 2 million metres on the ERG, so there'll be a Trade Me listing that we might link to in this week
for my
running machine.
I've already burnt it. It's gone.
Yeah. But how did you fare? Because you told me that there were other people in this lunacy. So how did you?
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, I was a bit surprised. I came 25th in New Zealand. Yeah. Although I should also mention the person that came first did 4.7 million metres. Yeah.
Wow.
He clearly has far too much time on his hands.
Well, congrats. It's an amazing achievement.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Cheers.